What if I told you the most instructive business biography I've read this year isn't about a CEO, isn't about a venture capitalist, and has absolutely nothing to do with Silicon Valley? But it will teach you more about how to dominate your industry, rebuild yourself from the wreckage, and compound excellence across decades than almost anything else you could put your hands on. I spent a few days deep inside 3 books on Roger Federer: the biography, Christopher Clary's The Master and the Quest for Perfection, and totaling over thousands of pages of documented excellence. And I took notes on every single principle that applies directly to what you and I are trying to build. Today, you're going to learn how a rage-filled, racket-smashing Swiss teenager became the most dominant, most beloved, and most studied competitor in the history of professional sports. Not because of his talent, but because of a series of deliberate, painful, systematic decisions to evolve himself. You're going to learn why the death of his mentor became the fire that forged a champion. You're going to learn the specific algorithm he used to dominate for 2 decades. And you're going to walk away understanding one thing above everything else: stagnation is regression. Now, let's get into it. I want to be clear about what we're doing here. I read 3 books, over thousands of pages, and I edited down everything. Every tournament result, every match statistics, every journalist anecdote, down to just the principles, the operating system underneath the career. Because here's the thing. Most people look at Roger Federer and they see a natural. They see a gift from God. They see effortless grace. And that framing is one of the most dangerous lies in the study of excellence. Because what you actually see when you go deep into the documents, when you read what his coaches said, when you read what his fitness trainer said, when you read what the people inside the locker room said, is something radically different. What you see is a calculated, relentless, sometimes agonizing process of self-construction. And that process applies directly to building a company or becoming a great investor. There are 3 things I want you to get from today. First, how to transform a liability into the foundation of your greatest strength. Roger's worst quality, his explosive, uncontrollable temper, became the source of his most powerful competitive edge once he learned to channel it. Second, how to use a tragedy as a rocket fuel. The death of his most important mentor didn't break him. It redefined the entire trajectory of his career in a single moment of grief-stricken clarity. Third, how to make a calculated, terrifying bet on yourself when you're already the best in the world. Most people at the peak play it safe. Federer did the opposite twice. There is a line buried in the Renee Stuffer's biography. It comes from an interview Federer gave in 2017, 15 years ago into professional career, and I think it explains his entire life. He was talking about Peter Carter, his childhood coach, who died in a car accident in 2002. And he said this, quote unquote, "He didn't want me to be a wasted talent. I guess it was something of a wake-up call for me when he passed away and I really started to train hard. It was him who compelled me to decide that from now on, I wouldn't waste my talent. I wanted to go further, invest more into my career, and be happier." Do not waste your talent. That's the whole thing. That's the entire career compressed into 5 words. Do not waste your talent. Write that down. Because what you're going to see over and over and over as we go through his life is that every major turning point, every reinvention, every comeback, every painful decision came down to that single commitment. Don't waste what you have. Go further. Invest more. Evolve or die. Well, we'll come back to this mantra multiple times because it's the engine. So the first principle, the raw material doesn't determine the outcome, the work does. So Roger Federer was born on August 8th, 1981 in Switzerland. His father, Robert, was a lab technician who played amateur tennis. His mother, Lynette, was from South Africa, a gifted sportswoman who played hockey at regional level before giving it up. Both parents played tennis competitively in local tournaments. So yes, the genetics were there. Yes, the environment was there. But here is what the books make crystal clear. The talent alone was pointing nowhere useful for a very long time. At 3.5, he was hitting balls over the net. At 4, he could string 20 or 30 consecutive shots. His father said he had unbelievable coordination. But here's what else his family said. His sister called him the little devil. His mother said he was very lively, a bundle of energy, and therefore sometimes difficult. When he lost at board games, okay, not tennis, he threw the dice and figurines across the living room. He was the kid who couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, couldn't stop himself from smashing things when he was frustrated. His school performance was average. Teachers couldn't hold his attention. He was in a language his coaches would later use. An unpolished diamond. The lesson here is simple and brutal. Raw talent is table stakes. It's the entry ticket. What separates the greats from people who should have been great is what happens next. And what Roger was going to discover, not quickly, but through years of grinding, painful, sometimes humiliating experience, is that talent without discipline is just potential energy with nowhere to go. It vibrates. It explodes. Sometimes it destroys the very thing it's supposed to power. Principle number 2, pick your environment deliberately because environment shapes you. This is underrated in the Federer story. He was lucky to be born in Basel. Why? Because Basel sits on the border of Germany, France, and Switzerland. From childhood, Federer was switching languages, switching cultural contexts, adapting. He grew up speaking Swiss, German, and English simultaneously because of his South African mother. He added French. He traveled to South Africa as a small child. His brain was, from the very beginning, being trained for adaptability. But there was also something more specific. There happened to be a man named Peter Carter, an Australian former professional player who joined Swiss tennis and ended up as Federer's coach. Carter had a career singles record of 52-98. He was not a superstar. He was someone who had competed, who knew the game from the inside, who understood the gap between talent and excellence. And Carter had one particular gift to give Roger Federer that would become the signature weapon of his entire career, the one-handed backhand. In the 1990s, every coach in the world was telling young players to use two-handed backhand. More control, more power, safer. The industry consensus was overwhelming. Carter looked at Federer's natural movement, his athleticism, his feel for the ball, and made a different call. He taught him one-handed backhand with a massive step into the shot. Other coaches at the time, coaches with impressive credentials, came to watch Federer train and pulled Carter aside. One of them, Darren Cahill, who would later coach Andre Agassi and then Simona Halep, pulled Carter aside and said essentially, "Mate, that backhand, you're going to have to fix that. The kid is going to get destroyed." Carter held firm. The one-handed backhand became the most aesthetically celebrated shot in the history of tennis. It became the weapon that produced points of almost incomprehensible beauty, and it became one of the most studied techniques in the sport. Coaches now teach it specifically because of Federer. Carter saw something nobody else saw. He trusted his judgment over the consensus. He was right. This is exactly what Edwin Land did at Polaroid when everyone told him instant photography was technically impossible. This is what Steve Jobs did at Apple when every focus group told him computers needed keyboards and mice and the iPhone was going to fail. And the people who shape the industries are almost always the people who ignored the consensus. All right, principle number 3, understand what's actually blocking you. Diagnose the real problem. So by 2001, Federer was a professional. He was ranked inside the top 100. He had natural talent that made experienced tennis people stop and stare. John McEnroe watched him and said, he has so many opportunities that he sometimes confuses himself. Peter Lundgren, his first private coach, a former top 25 player himself, said something even more specific and more interesting. He has to be able to also win ugly. He's an artist. And when his strokes don't go to plan, he becomes irritated and loses his concentration. Here is the diagnosis. The problem wasn't technical. The problem wasn't physical. The problem was psychological. Roger had built an identity around playing beautiful tennis. And when the beauty wasn't available, when the conditions were bad, when his opponent was scrambling everything, when the match was ugly and grinding, he fell apart. Because ugly winning felt like losing to him. It felt like a betrayal of who he was. This is one of the most dangerous traps a talented person can fall into. You become so identified with excellence in one dimension that you become brittle everywhere else. Roger needed to learn something that every great founder eventually learns. The goal is to win. Not to win beautifully, not to win on your own terms, to win. And sometimes winning looks terrible, and you do it anyway. The turning point of understanding this came from someone unexpected, Mirka Vavrinec, who would later become his wife. He met her at the 2000 Sydney Olympics, where they were both representing Switzerland. And when he saw in Mirka, day after day was something that shook him. She would train for 5 or 6 hours without a break, without a lapse in concentration. He could barely hold focus for an hour. He watched her, stunned and full of admiration, and later said, "She made me work harder. Without her, maybe I would never have found that side of me." The person who modeled discipline for him wasn't a coach. It was the woman he loved. Remember that. The people closest to you shape your operating standards more than any book or mentor ever will. Now, we get to that inflection point, the moment everything changed. And I want to be clear, this is not a comfortable section, but it is the most important section because sometimes the thing that transforms a person isn't incremental, it's catastrophic. So in August 2002, Roger is 22 years old. He's inside the top 15 in the world. He's been predicted by almost everyone who has watched him play to become number one. He has the talent. Everyone says so. But he's also in a prolonged crisis. He's losing matches. He should be winning. His creativity has vanished. His confidence has crumbled. His coach, Peter Lundgren, watched him and said, "He's no longer himself on the court. Technically, nothing is wrong in his game. It's all in his head." And then, in the middle of this crisis, the news arrives. Peter Carter, his important development coach, the man who gave him his signature backhand, the man who had been quietly nurturing his talent since he was a boy, has been killed in a car accident. He was 36 years old on his honeymoon in South Africa, a driver swerving to avoid an oncoming vehicle. The car smashed through a bridge railing and fell 3 meters before landing on its roof. Federer later described the impact as seismic. We spent so much time together since I was a boy. In my youth, I saw him every day. It's so terrible. He died so young and so unexpectedly. At the funeral, inside Glenhard's church in the old part of Basel, Federer stood in front of 200 people, coaches, players, journalists, friends. And as he walked into the summer air, he said, "Every defeat in tennis is nothing compared to a moment like this." And then something remarkable happened. The grief didn't paralyze him. It clarified him. Go back to the mantra. He didn't want me to be a wasted talent. In 2017, 15 years later, in an interview where he broke down in tears talking about Peter Carter, Federer explained exactly what the death had done to him. It was a wake-up call. It was a moment when he decided, not stumbled into, not gradually evolved toward, but decided that he would not waste his talent, that he would invest more, that he would go further, that Carter's belief in him deserved to be honored. This is one of the most powerful motivational mechanisms in history of high performance. And you see it everywhere when you study the greats. Carnegie dedicated his early career to proving his mentor, Thomas Scott, right. Jobs, after being fired from Apple, described it as the best thing that ever happened to him because the freedom from success forced him to rebuild from the first principles. The defining catalyst is almost never winning. It's almost always loss. The question is whether you let the loss collapse you or convert you. Federer chose conversion. After Carter's death, Roger went to work. Not metaphorically, literally, systematically. And here's where I want to give you the algorithm. Because this is the part that entrepreneurs almost always overlook when they study elite performers. Everyone wants to talk about the natural gifts. Nobody wants to talk about the infrastructure that turns natural gifts into sustained dominance. Federer had assembled a team around himself, and I want you to understand how he thought about it. He wasn't just hiring coaches. He was building a system. And here are the 5 pillars of that system. 1, the technical foundation. Peter Carter. Carter gave him the physical vocabulary, the one-handed backhand, the footwork patterns, the shot selection, intuition that becomes automatic when you drilled it 10,000 times. Lundgren took that foundation and tried to add the competitive mindset. How to compete when you're not playing your best tennis. How to win ugly. 2, the physical infrastructure. This one is underrated to a criminal degree. Paganini was a fitness trainer who had worked with Marc Rosset for 17 years. He was a former violinist before he became a coach, and he treated the human body the way musicians treat instruments. Precise, methodical, long-term. When Paganini first assessed Federer, he didn't see a future world number 1. He saw enormous potential being masked by athletic weakness. His athleticism was poor, Paganini said. There was enormous potential for improvement in his footwork and physical strength. And here's the key line. His tremendous talent allowed him to mask his athletic weaknesses. This is the diagnostic insight that changes everything. Federer's talent was so high that it was hiding the gaps. He was winning despite the gaps. The gaps were invisible to most observers, but Paganini could see them, and he knew that against the very best players in the world, those gaps would eventually be exploited. So, he built a 3-year physical development plan. Not a 3-week plan, a 3-year plan. Paganini developed what he called integrated fitness training, where Roger would run until he reached exhaustion and then immediately go back on the court and play. Why? When you're tired, your natural reflexes emerge as well as all your bad habits. The idea was to expose the flaws under stress, not to hide from them. This is exactly how the best founders stress test their products. You don't discover the failure modes in the comfortable conditions. You find them when everything is going wrong and the pressure is maximum. The results were staggering. Within 3 years, Roger could outrun a regional sprinter for the first 30 meters. He could complete 3,300 meters in 12 minutes. He could squat 150 kilograms. He went from a player who lost fitness battles to opponents who trained harder than him to a player who could sustain championship level tennis for 5 hours in July heat. Pillar number 3. Here's the thing that nobody talks about. It's called pillar number 3, psychological rewiring. And the physical and technical improvements were necessary, but not sufficient. What also had to change was the internal narrative. Earlier in his career, Roger admitted something remarkable. He said he sometimes had the strange feeling that his opponent deserved to win more than him because he had the impression they trained harder. Think about that. He was carrying around a guilt complex in the middle of competitions. He was self-sabotaging because some part of him didn't believe he had earned the right to win. Once Paganini installed the physical foundation, the guilt evaporated. Mentally, I felt very good, Roger said early in 2001, because I know that I've conditioned myself well. I know I can keep up the pace. This is not a small thing. This is everything. Confidence in competition is almost entirely downstream of the work you did in private. When you know you've done the work, when you've actually done it, not when you've told yourself you've done it, you perform differently. The self-doubt doesn't have any purchase. It can't grip anywhere because there's no guilt underneath it. Now, let's move on to pillar number 4. It's called the scheduling intelligence. This is the one that I think is the most transferable to building a company, and Roger was obsessive about his schedule. Not obsessive the way most people use that word, meaning erratic and reactive. Obsessive in the most deliberate, calculated, almost algorithmic sense. Christopher Clary writes that Roger usually had an idea of the next 1.5 years and a very good idea about the next 9 months. He could tell you what he'd be doing on any given Monday before any given tournament weeks in advance. Why does this matter? Well, because exhaustion kills creativity, because burnout is the enemy of sustained excellence, because the people who flame out early, and we've seen this in sports, we've seen it in startups constantly, almost always flame out because they didn't manage their energy. They managed their time, they confused activity with productivity, they confused presence with performance. And Roger looked at Bjorn Borg's career, one of the greatest grass court players who ever lived, who walked away at 25 because he was completely burnt out, and he decided he wanted something different. He deliberately played fewer tournaments than most of his competitors. He took longer off seasons. He protected the schedule with ferocity. It's in the mix that I find the resources for more, he said. The energy for more. Pillar number 5. The brand as a force multiplier. The 5th pillar doesn't get talked about enough in the context of Federer's competitive career, but it absolutely belongs here. At the same time, he was building an on-court machine. Federer and his agent, Tony Godsick, were building something equally powerful off it. They created a management company called Team 8. They secured a 10-year deal in Uniqlo, reportedly worth $300 million. They organized exhibition matches in stadiums. The match in Africa against Nadal in 2020 drew 51,954 people to a football stadium in Cape Town, the largest crowd in tennis history. They created a demand that went far beyond tennis rankings. The business insight here is the same one for Jeff Bezos built Amazon on. If you're the best at what you do and you're trusted and you operate with integrity, you can expand the circumference on your market almost without limit. Roger wasn't just selling tennis. He was selling grace, inspiration, the idea that excellence and elegance don't have to be in conflict. And that turned out to be a product with essentially infinite demand. Now, let's talk about the championship years because the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Between 2003 and 2012, Federer won 17 Grand Slam titles. He held the world number 1 ranking for 237 consecutive weeks. That's 4 years and nearly 200 days without relinquishing the top spot. He spent more weeks at number 1 than any player in history, 310 total. He won Wimbledon 5 consecutive times. He won the US Open 5 consecutive times. He won the Australian Open 4 times and Roland Garros once. But I want to focus on how, not on the statistics, because the how is where the lessons are. So, the first Wimbledon 2003, he was 21 years old and he only lost 1 set through the entire tournament. But the moment that defined the run wasn't the final. It was the warm-up before his 4th round match against Feliciano Lopez. Federer felt a sharp pain in his back. It had been troubling him after the previous round. He stood on practice court thinking he would have to retire from the tournament. Here's what he said to himself. See what happens. Maybe I'll keep up with him in the first set. Maybe Lopez will be nervous and you can still beat him. That's it. That's the mindset. It's not I'm going to smash through this. Not denial, but completely pragmatic, almost detached assessment of what the immediate situation allows for. What can I actually do right now? Let me see. He went out there. He managed the back. He beat Lopez. He beat Roddick in the semifinals. He beat Felipe Pusis in the final. He became Wimbledon champion. In the immediate aftermath, he said something that I wrote in the large letters in my notebook. You're only a champion when you lift the trophy at the end. This is what I did, so I am a champion. And then he said something even more important. Now I have proven it to everyone. If my career ended today, it would be okay. He wasn't celebrating. He was recalibrating. He was already asking what's next. This is exactly what Sam Walton did after Walmart's first major expansion success. He went back to the store the next day. He was already thinking about the next town. The mentality of relentless builder is not to savor the win. It's to understand what win proves about what's possible and immediately go after the next level. And now, I have to talk about Nadal because the Nadal rivalry is not just the greatest rivalry in sports history. It is a masterclass in how to respond to a competitor who has found structural advantage against you. Here's the physics. Rafael Nadal is left-handed. His topspin forehand naturally kicks into Federer's backhand, the weaker side of any right-handed player. And especially problematic for one-handed backhand like Federer's. It's not that Nadal was simply better. It's that his style created a specific geometric problem for Federer's game. On clay, especially the slowest surface, this structural disadvantage was magnified to almost unfair proportions. Roger knew this. His team knew this. And here's what I find fascinating. The response wasn't to change who he was. It was to evolve around the problem while staying true to his core game. He developed a new tactic called the SABR, the sneak attack by Roger, where he would sprint forward to hit the return of serve from inside the baseline, taking time away from Nadal and disrupting a geometric setup. He worked obsessively on his backhand drive. He switched to a larger headed racket, a bigger hitting surface, to improve margin in extended rallies. He started skipping clay season tournaments entirely to preserve his body for Grand Slams where he could compete more effectively. Every single one of these decisions was counterintuitive. A player at number one in the world doesn't switch rackets, doesn't skip entire seasons, doesn't radically alter a tactic that has worked for years. These are the moves of a player who is losing, who is desperate, who is flailing, except Roger made them not out of desperation, but out of cold, calculated, strategic analysis. This is exactly what Andy Grove described in Only the Paranoid Survive. The companies that dominate are the ones that sense the strategic inflection point before it kills them and adapt. Intel abandoning memory chips to go all in on microprocessors. Netflix abandoning DVD mail to go all in on streaming. The move looks crazy to outsiders. It looks suicidal to the people inside who are comfortable. But the leaders who make it understand something the others don't. That holding on to what made you successful is often the most direct route to failure. Roger understood that holding on to the exact same game that got him to number one would not be enough to keep him there. He had to evolve, and the evolution had to be specific, surgical, and tied to a clear diagnosis of exactly what the competition was doing to him. So by 2013, Federer's body was sending messages he couldn't ignore. His back, which had troubled him for years, was becoming genuine liability. His knee was deteriorating in ways that wouldn't become publicly known for several more years. He was losing matches to players he had dominated for a decade. The losses didn't look like close battles, they looked like mismatches. The press started writing about the end of an era. Former champions wrote op-eds about natural life cycles of sporting greatness. The consensus, and again, remember the consensus, was that Roger's career was entering its final chapter. So in 2016 of January, playing at the Australian Open against Novak, Roger injured his knee. He had surgery. He missed the rest of the clay season. He came back early and re-injured it. A second surgery was required. He missed the second half of 2016 entirely. And at 35 years old, after 2 knee surgeries, having not won a Grand Slam in 4.5 years, the consensus became unanimous. It was over. Even people who loved him, who had spent their careers watching him play, started using the past tense. And here's where the story gets almost unbelievably good, because what happened next in Melbourne in January 2017 is one of the greatest competitive comebacks in the history of any sport, in any domain. And it wasn't luck. It was some miraculous physical recovery. It was the result of another calculated, deliberate, terrifying bet on himself. During these months of recovery, Federer did something he had been talking about and resisting for years. He switched to a larger headed racket, a 97 square inch frame instead of the 90 square inch racket he'd used for his entire career. Bigger sweet spot, more forgiveness on off center strikes. The sacrifice? Slight less precise control. The gain? More power, more margin, more ability to compete in his extended rallies at age 35. Think about what this requires psychologically. You are one of the greatest players who ever live. Your racket is an extension of your body. You've used essentially the same technology for your entire adult career. You won 20 Grand Slam titles with this equipment, and now you're going to change it at 35 after 2 knee surgeries when every sport journalist on earth is writing on your obituary. You're going to change the fundamental tool of your craft based on a calculated bet that the adjustment will compensate for the physical decline and extend your competitive window? This is not the move of a player clinging to the past. This is the move of a player making peace with the present and betting intelligently on the future. Now, you're probably wondering what the result is. Well, in Melbourne, 2017 of January, Roger defeated Kei Nishikori. He defeated Mishka Zverev. He defeated Thomas Berge. He defeated Stan Wawrinka, his training partner and fellow Grand Slam champion, in the semifinals. And then he faced Rafael Nadal in the final. Nadal, the man who had been his greatest tormentor, the man who had beaten him on clay so thoroughly that at one point during the 2008 French Open, the scoreline was 6-1, 6-3, 6-0. And in that moment in Melbourne, down a break in the 5th set, Roger made a decision that his team described as one of the most aggressive tactical pivots they have ever witnessed. He started attacking Nadal's forehand, Nadal's strength, instead of his backhand. He changed the geometry of the entire match. He started dictating. He won the 5th set 6-3. At 35 years old, after 2 knee surgeries, 5 years without a Grand Slam title, again, the man who had beaten him more than anyone else in their careers. And it was over when the match point landed and Roger collapsed to the courts in tears when he said, it wasn't about the trophy. It wasn't about the records. He said, it's amazing. I don't know how I did it. But we know exactly how he did it. He didn't waste his talent. He invested more. He went further. He honored the belief of a man who died too young on a road in South Africa. He did exactly what he promised Peter Carter he would do 15 years later with a new racket, at an age when the world had already written him off. Now, Christopher Clarey has this incredible observation in The Master. He writes that Roger has transcended tennis, and he explains how. Not by using his platform to become a political figure, not by courting controversy, not by expanding into entertainment or politics or media in the way that some athletes do. He transcended tennis by remaining entirely within the confines of the game and doing it so brilliantly, so gracefully, so completely that the game itself became larger because of him. This is the old school model of brand building. You become so exceptional at your core product that the reputation radiates outward without effort. You don't have to manufacture the identity. You don't have to hire a PR firm to craft the narrative. The work does it for you. Roger understood something else about longevity that's deeply counterintuitive. He understood the enemy of sustained excellence is not failure, it's boredom. In the car in Buenos Aires in 2012, when Clary asked him if he understood the word jaded, Roger answered with a clarity that stopped me when I read it. He said, "Really? That's what I try to avoid by having the proper schedule and the proper fun and the proper change. Because if you do the same things too many times, too often, you get bored of it. It doesn't matter how extraordinary your life might be." The proper fun. He was protecting his capacity for enjoyment as a competitive asset. He was treating his enthusiasm for the game the way the CFO treats working capital, as something finite that has to be managed, replenished, and never allowed to run zero. When his team arranged for a Mandarin teacher to come to their hotel room in Shanghai, not because Roger had to learn Mandarin, but because he wanted to, because it was interesting, because absorbing new things kept him alive and curious. That's not quirky anecdote. That's a deliberate strategy for sustaining the energy that fuels performance. Paul Anacone, his former coach, said it directly. Traveling the world drained Pete Sampras' energy. Roger gets energy from it. That's not an accident of temperament. That's a deliberately constructed relationship with experience. 5 rules for building something that lasts. So let me give you the distilled algorithm, the operating principles pulled from his entire career, directly applicable to what you and I are doing. If you're an investor, if you're building a company, if you're a founder, if you are a executive, here's the rule 1. Diagnose the problem, not the presenting symptoms. Federer's problem in his early career wasn't his backhand. It wasn't his fitness. It was his psychology, specifically and identities, so tied to beautiful execution. The ugly winning felt impossible. If Paganini had tried to fix its surface symptoms without addressing the root cause, nothing would have changed. Go deeper. Always go deeper. Rule number 2, build the infrastructure before you need it. Paganini gave Federer a 3-year physical transformation plan when he was still inside the top 100 and winning. Not when he was failing. Not the work that produced 20 Grand Slam titles began before anyone thought it was necessary. The best companies are built the same way. Amazon built the infrastructure for the third-party sellers before it needed it. Apple built the App Store before anyone knew what apps were. Build before you're going, not where you are. Rule number 3, use your losses as the clearest possible diagnostic. Every major loss in Roger's career, the 2008 Wimbledon final, the 2019 Wimbledon final, the years of losses to Nadal on clay, produce specific surgical adaptations. He didn't spiral. He didn't despair. He diagnosed what exactly happened. What does this reveal about the gap between where I am and where I need to be? The question, asked relentlessly and honestly, is one of the most powerful toolkits in your arsenal. Now, rule number 4, never let your past success prevent your next evolution. The racket switch is a template for this. The thing that made him great, the 90 square inch racket with its precise control, had to be upgraded when the game required it. This is the Andy Grove principle. This is the Reed Hastings principle. The leaders who sustain dominance are the ones who are willing to cannibalize their past success in service of future relevance. And the last one, rule number 5, manage your energy, not just your time. The schedule, the deliberate rest, enthusiasm for travel and learning and new experiences, all of this was in service of one goal: sustaining the competitive energy that powers performance. Energy is the limiting resource. Time is abundant. People who burn out early are almost always confuse activity for effectiveness. They're always on. They're always available. They're always grinding. And one day, they wake up and the fire is gone. Roger never let the fire go out. He tended it obsessively. Now, when I finished these books, I sat with my notes for a long time. I have pages and pages of observation, tactical breakdowns, psychological insights. But when I asked myself what the single most important takeaway was, what I would tell a founder, executive, a billionaire, a leader, is building something from scratch. If they had 5 minutes of my time, it came down to this. The enemy of your potential isn't competition. It isn't the market. It isn't bad luck or bad timing or bad circumstance. The enemy of your potential is the version of yourself that is comfortable with where you are. Roger Federer, at number 1 in the world with 5 Wimbledon titles, with 237 consecutive weeks at the top rankings, that Roger Federer was still asking, what do I need to change? What gap exists between who I am and who I need to become? What is the competition exposing about my limitations? How do I evolve? That question, asked with honesty and urgency and without ego, is the source of everything. And there's a quote from Novak, Federer's fiercest competitor, the man who beat him in arguably the most painful loss of his career at Wimbledon in 2019. And I want to end with it because it tells you everything about the culture Roger created. The standard he set for an entire generation of competitors. Novak said, the number 1 requirement to succeed at this level is the constant desire and open-mindedness to master and improve and evolve yourself in every aspect. Stagnation is regression. Roger's greatest rival learned his most important lesson from watching Roger operate. That is a legacy. That is the definition of a life well lived. Do not waste your talent. Go further. Invest more. Be happier. The greatest sportsman who ever lived spent 40 years turning that 5-word instruction from a dead man into the operating system of his existence. The question is whether you and I have the guts to do the same.